Welcome to our channel. Without wasting time, let's dive right into our true horror stories that will scare and lure you to sleep. The dark screen is meant to keep the room dark and enable you to sleep comfortably while listening. Imagine standing in a house, silent and alone, when a voice softly whispers your name. You turn, but no one is there. What if I told you that voice didn't belong to anyone living? By the end of this story, you might find yourself questioning what truly belongs in the darkness and what waits in the spaces we dare not look. Emily Reed had never been the type to believe in legends, ghosts, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. She was practical to a fault, using reason as armor against the emotional wreckage of her life. Recently divorced, financially strained, and emotionally drained, Emily thought the inheritance of her estranged grandmother's house was a chance to rebuild, not just her bank account, but her sense of self. The letter from the estate lawyer had been brief. She was now the sole owner of a countryside mansion she'd never seen, left to her by a woman she hadn't spoken to since childhood. There was only one peculiar note at the bottom of the letter. The basement door is locked for a reason. Leave it that way. But Emily wasn't one to heed cryptic warnings. To her, it was just an old house, walls and wood, nothing more. The first glimpse of the house sent a shiver through her, though she'd never admit it. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its Victorian design long weathered by decades of neglect. A canopy of dense, ancient trees surrounded the property, casting the grounds in shadow even on bright days. The gardens, once meticulously kept, were now a tangled mess of thorns and weeds. Inside, the air felt heavy. Dust coated every surface, and faint drafts carried a chill that lingered, no matter how many windows she opened. The wallpaper curled in corners, revealing scars in the plaster beneath. The furniture, left untouched since her grandmother's time, seemed to sit like silent sentinels, watching her every move. In the main hallway, an old family photo hung askew on the wall. Emily's grandmother stood in the center, her youthful face stern yet graceful. To her right was a child Emily didn't recognize, though something about the child's hollow stare made her stomach twist. Scribbled on the back of the frame were 5 simple words: "He watches us all." It didn't take long for Emily to notice the peculiarities. At first, they were small enough to dismiss. A creak on the stairs when she was sitting still, the faint sound of footsteps in the attic above her. The rocking chair in the attic seemed to shift positions on its own, though Emily rationalized it as her own faulty memory. At night, faint knocks came from the walls, irregular and faint, like an animal trapped between the wooden boards. The basement door, however, was another matter entirely. It stood at the end of a narrow corridor, its wood dark and scarred with a strange, jagged symbol carved near the center. The lock was ancient, rusted, and immovable, as though time itself had fused it shut. One evening, as she cleaned the sitting room, Emily felt a draft from behind her. Turning, she realized the air wasn't coming from an open window. It was seeping up through the floorboards, cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. Among the belongings left behind was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and fragile. The diary belonged to her grandmother, though its contents were far from the mundane reflections Emily had expected. The entries began innocently enough: descriptions of garden parties, recipes, and weather reports. But as Emily read further, the tone darkened. "There are rules to this house," one entry read. "It listens when we speak, so we must tread carefully." Another warned, "The watcher grows restless when we forget the rituals. He needs the lock to hold." The final entry was the most alarming. "I am old now, and my hands shake too much to continue. Whoever inherits this house must know, the lock must never break. If it does, he will find us all." As the evening stretched on, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the dim light above, felt like a signal, as though the house was waiting for her next move. The first night in the house passed with a quiet unease. As Emily lay in bed, the whisper came, soft, distant, almost indistinct. Emily. It was as though someone was calling her name from the farthest corner of the house. She sat up, her heart racing, but the sound faded into the wind, rattling the windows. "It's just the house settling," she muttered to herself, pulling the blankets tighter around her. The second night, things grew harder to dismiss. As she arranged the books in the study, a lamp toppled over behind her. She whipped around, startled, but saw nothing. Moments later, a stack of papers scattered to the floor, though no breeze had passed through. By the third night, the unease had sharpened into fear. As Emily walked down the hallway toward her bedroom, she saw it, just for a fraction of a second. A shadowy figure, hunched and still, standing at the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, and it was gone, leaving her with the unmistakable sense of being watched. The house seemed to shift with each passing day. The air in certain rooms turned unnaturally cold, biting at Emily's skin, no matter how many layers she wore. A metallic smell, sour and pungent, lingered in the kitchen and the living room, so thick it seemed to stick to her clothes. Her flashlight, always freshly loaded with batteries, flickered whenever she entered the attic or the narrow hallway leading to the basement. The beam would grow weaker and weaker, forcing her to navigate by touch and memory. Worst of all were the footsteps. At night, as she lay in bed, she would hear them above her, a slow, deliberate pacing. It started in the attic, but soon moved to the hallway outside her door. When she worked up the courage to look, the space was empty, yet the sound continued. Emily tried to convince herself there was a logical explanation. Perhaps the old house had an intruder, a squatter, or some neighborhood kid playing pranks. Determined to catch them, she set up cameras in every room, angling them toward the attic, the basement door, and her bedroom. The footage at first showed nothing unusual, just the stillness of an empty house. But when she reviewed one clip in slow motion, her blood ran cold. As she slept, a shadow moved across her bed, its long fingers brushing her hair before vanishing into the darkness. Emily's fear reached its peak when the rocking chair in the attic began to move violently on its own, slamming against the wall until it splintered. Shaking with adrenaline, she grabbed a crowbar and marched to the basement door. The lock was old, rusted, and gave way with an eerie snap. The door creaked open to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. As Emily stepped down, the smell hit her first, a damp, putrid stench that made her gag. The basement was unlike the rest of the house. Its walls were lined with strange, jagged symbols, painted in dark, dried streaks that Emily didn't want to identify. At the center of the room stood a decrepit crib, its wooden edges clawed and splintered. But it was the mirror that stopped her in her tracks. Tall and ornate, it stood against the far wall. When she looked into it, her reflection stared back. But it didn't match her. The face in the glass moved on its own, tilting its head and mouthing silent words that Emily couldn't understand. The house roared to life. The whispers that had once been faint were now deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming her name. The shadowy figure she had glimpsed before now stepped into full view. It was childlike in size, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, its fingers thin and clawed. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You broke the seal. You've let him out. Now he will find you." The words sent a chill through Emily's very core. The figure began to move toward her, each step echoing in the cold, damp space. Desperate, Emily stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. But the house was no longer the same. It groaned and shifted, as though something far older and darker had awakened. The house groaned under an unseen pressure, walls cracking, as though an invisible force was tearing the structure apart from within. Shadows slithered along the floors and walls, gathering into the corners, pooling under doors, and growing in mass until the entire house seemed consumed by darkness. Emily, clutching the diary, stumbled through the chaos. The whispers had become guttural wails, disembodied voices screaming incomprehensible warnings. Objects hurled themselves across the room, tables flipping, glass shattering, chairs splintering as though the house itself had turned against her. From the depths of the shadows, the entity emerged. It was no longer childlike. Its form had stretched, its hollow eyes now glowing faintly with a malevolent light. It moved with an unnatural gait, its limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Emily ran, the diary pressed against her chest, as flashbacks of her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The lock must never break. Seal the door, no matter the cost. The phrase repeated in a loop, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. She tripped over a fallen beam, landing hard on the floor. As the entity closed in, its long fingers reaching toward her, she remembered the basement, the ritual, the diary's cryptic instructions. There was a way to stop this, if she could reach the basement in time. Emily scrambled to her feet, darting toward the basement door. The air grew thicker with each step, her lungs burning as though she were inhaling smoke. She threw open the door and descended the stairs, the entity's guttural growls close behind her. In the basement, the ritual knife lay waiting, its blade dull and tarnished, but unmistakably sharp. The instructions in the diary were clear. A blood sacrifice was required to reseal the entity. As the entity entered the basement, its form seemed to stretch to fill the room, its face mere inches from hers. Its voice was no longer a whisper, but a thunderous roar. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Emily's hands trembled as she picked up the knife. The diary's instructions detailed a sigil that needed to be carved into flesh, a binding mark that would trap the entity within the house forever. But the price was steep. Her choice was clear. Use her own blood and life force to complete the ritual, ensuring the entity would never escape. Or flee the house, leaving the entity free to wreak havoc on the world beyond. Tears streamed down her face as she made her decision. Holding the knife steady, she carved the intricate sigil into her arm, each line of the symbol burning with an otherworldly heat. The entity roared, its form thrashing wildly, as the sigil began to glow. The house trembled violently, the walls splitting as light burst forth from the sigil. Emily collapsed to her knees, the knife slipping from her hand. Her final thoughts were of her grandmother, of the sacrifice she too must have made to protect the world from the darkness. When the light faded, the house stood eerily silent. The entity was gone, its form dissolved into nothingness. But Emily's lifeless body remained, slumped on the cold basement floor, the sigil on her arm glowing faintly before fading away. Years passed. The house was eventually sold, its history buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. A young family moved in, their laughter filling the halls where once there had been only silence. But the story did not end there. One evening, the family's youngest child, a boy of 7, wandered into the attic. There, tucked into a corner beneath the rubble, he found an old, leather-bound diary. Curious, he opened it, his small fingers tracing the faded handwriting. As he read the first line aloud, the house seemed to hold its breath. "He watches us all." The camera fades to black as the boy looks up, a shadow beginning to creep across the room. Would you have the courage to make Emily's choice? To give everything, knowing you'll never see the world again, just to save it? Let me know in the comments below. What would you have done? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good scare. And make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Because next time, we'll uncover the chilling truth behind the lighthouse no one dares to enter. Thank you for watching. Subscribe now for more.